Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome to the Property Couch podcast. G'day, mate. How are you?
Good, mate. Yourself?
I'm very good. Hey,
mate, are you wearing the black t-shirt and wearing the white sort of iPhone?
Yeah, I am, mate. It's going to be lost on an audio, but for you and me looking at each other via Zoom, you know,
we've got the big win. We got black and white big win. Nathan's send off. Is that what you were doing for me?
Well played. Trying the black and white angle on that one. Yes, no, I did get the memo, mate, to wear the black t-shirt. I tend to wear usually a black or a white one throughout my whole life anyway.
Did you tip them? Did you tip the pies?
Did you?
Yes, I did. Wow. And I called it before I tipped them on our little tipping thing. So I think I was the only one.
Hey, listen,
silly one.
In your defense, and I really like to do this because I really hate having our podcast have any more black and white than it needs. But there is a podcast called the WAAY Games. Mark Howard interviews a bunch of crew in the sports world, which is fabulous. And he interviewed Nathan Buckley. And I must admit, I thought Nathan Buckley was a bit of a fig jam until listening to that interview. And then I thought he's an evolved, developed, intelligent, emotionally intelligent human being. And I actually really enjoyed the interview. And I find this difficult to admit to you, but since that interview, I've rated him quite highly. So
he would openly admit to that he went through a transformation there, and he's continuing improving, just like the rest of us. We're all humans. We make mistakes, but I like his point. Any regrets? No regrets, just learning opportunities.
Yeah, either win or you learn. That's our motto in our house.
Very true.
So very, very good. We won't block this up with your platitudes around how well Collingwood fell asleep already. So, but anyway, we'll move on. Today we've got a really cool episode that I'm looking forward to doing with you, which is a bit of a riff. We're going to do the 6 property lessons from the board game Monopoly, Ben. So there are some wonderful lessons that we can learn here that we can apply to our lifestyle design plans that we have on this podcast to teach our community. Before we get there, my Mindset Minute theme today is I haven't done a James Clear quote for a while. I saw this one and thought it was really good. Patience is a competitive advantage, Ben. In a surprising number of fields, you can find success if you are simply willing to do the reasonable thing longer than most people. So that really lands pretty well. And I think about when I chat to James and he goes, look, success really is only doing a couple of things differently to most people. And it's sort of along those lines. And then I think about, the best property investors have been doing it for a long time. They've developed that patience. Everyone pulls out their favorite Warren Buffett quote at multiple times, but he's just the living proof of patience and holding on for the long term versus, you've seen it plenty of times in your professional life, Ben, and so have I, where people are chasing, the shiny object and they need the next thing and they've got to chase and they've got to catch up and they're pivoting from that and they're tacking to this, and it just shows that lack of patience. So unfortunately, there is no hack around time and patience when it comes to investing, but it landed for me. I thought it was a good thing, and as you know, I like to try and find something that gives people something to think about as they go into the weekend. So patience is a competitive advantage. In a surprising number of fields, you can find success if you are simply willing to do the reasonable thing longer than most people. There you go, folks.
Very nice.
Meditate on that for the coming week. All right, 6 property lessons from Monopoly. Before we kick this off, Ben, it's important to remind those folks what Monopoly is all about. It's players roll 2 6-sided dice to move around the game board, buying and trading properties and developing them with houses and hotels. Players collect rent from their opponents with the goal. Here's the goal, folks. If you've forgotten, if you haven't played it for a little while, or you've been in Mars and you've never played it at all, the goal is to drive everyone but yourself into bankruptcy. So you are the last human standing. So, Ben, when's the last time you played Monopoly?
Oh, well, the original game would have to be at least 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We played a lot when we were younger, but obviously with my two boys, we played a kids version, and there's not as much sort of depth to it. Like in other words, in some very basic games, you just land on it and you just get charged rent, and it's very simple. There's no building of houses, and then it evolves into the more complex game. So I did have to hit the memory banks there, Bryce, in terms of, okay, yes, that's right. And I remember, that when you run out of cash, you got to sell things and you got a mortgage in possession, So yes, it's a wonderful game. It's just a long game.
I remember one of my early thoughts around Monopoly is that real estate, you always have to negotiate lower on the value of the real estate. And I've since reflected on that because I obviously spent a whole professional life in property. And I grew up in Perth. I grew up in a suburb south of Perth, which is called Kwinana, Ben, which you're familiar with, which is near Rockingham, where you go and stay, where your parents-in-law live.
Yep.
And back when I grew up then, I was born in 75. So that was the first house I was in. And it was a lower socio-economic area that I grew up in. It's certainly gentrified heaps since then. So a shout out to all those people that live there now. But back when I grew up then, it was a very lower socio-economic part of the world.
New estate area. Yep.
Yeah, well, we were in this really old established part. It was houses built in the 70s and, those 70s facades. And so my dad I remember we put the house on the market in 1985 and he listed it for a price and we had to accept less than what we listed it for. And then I just thought, oh, okay, real estate. And so when I was negotiating early days, I just thought, well, if you paid, for say Oxford Street, you paid £300 or $300 if it's an Aussie version. If I was trying to negotiate with someone, I would always say, well, I'll give you $270 for it. And they're like, no, you want this one, you can have it for $320. I'm like, well, so it took a little while for me to compute that it was just a product of that first real estate transaction that I was exposed to. Because I wasn't exposed to the East Coast where it's auction and price guides and everything goes for 25% higher than the price guides and all that sort of stuff. So there are some foundational stuff that comes from this wonderful board game that was designed over 100 years ago. But so we're going to do the 6 property lessons from Monopoly. So the first one we're going to kick off with, Ben. Number 1 is always be patient. If you understand the game, the aim is to have all but one person bankrupt. Then you got to play the long game because it's a marathon, not a race. And there are definitely parallels here with the property game that we like to educate people on. But always be patient, Ben.
Yeah, one of the interesting things one of the big takeaways from Monopoly has always been the person with the most property wins. And we were, we go back 20 odd years, 25 years when we started in the investment space, Bryce. That's what we were taught. That was about getting the most number of properties and all of that. So that was that mindset, because when you are the final player, you have everything, right? It's almost like you own the bank. Every time someone's moving around that board, you're just hitting them with every property that you own. But I think the message that we're saying here is that as you move around the board, you can get yourself into some trouble if you try and buy everything you land on. So we're certainly going to come back to that as one of the other points. But I just find it that it is about being patient. It is about playing the long game. And in all elements, it's, you can be a very good player of Monopoly if you understand some of the probabilities, where you will get to at certain points in the game. So, yeah, I think from that point of view, everyone sort of says the big takeaway is the person with the most property. That's because the other people got gobbled up. But in real life, what we're saying to people is, buy well and be patient in what you buy, because you will get to a very, very good level. And that's why I love the patience message that we're sharing here in terms of the very first point, Bryce.
Well, let's extend on the point that you just raised there, Ben, because I find my youngest Samuel, he's 8, and his goal is to pretty much buy everything he lands on, and from the opening round, and then quickly realizing that if he's got no money left, and then he seconds around the spin of the board, someone asks him for rent, it's almost a meltdown. Oh, but this isn't fair. I haven't got enough money. But it's kind of the same, and I think we see it a lot in what we're doing. You and I have been involved professionally, personally and professionally in this industry for well over 20 years now, and we've seen lots of people play the "he who dies with the most property wins" game, but then see like. So then that makes the front page of the magazines that were really big throughout the noughties and the early part of this decade. The noughties and the tens. But what we didn't see at the end of that was people that were in extreme cash flow challenges, keeping one eye open at night, sleeping. I remember people who were riding the balance sheet game of growth, but then quickly eating up the growth because they needed to refinance as quickly and as creatively as they could so that they could actually just hold the portfolio. So therefore it's a status design game. He who dies with the most property wins. It's not actually a lifestyle design game. And so hopefully we've matured as an industry to help people understand that it isn't about that anymore. It's not about the status of having a massive monopoly empire. It's really just about being really conservatively clear on what you want for lifestyle, and then just go about accumulating in our philosophy 3 to 5 investment properties plus ideally your principal place of residence.
Yeah, it raises a good point around just investing in general, and it teaches us some good lessons about that too. And I suppose it also teaches some lessons around gambling, right? Like we know that poker machines, as an example, are geared to take a certain amount of money off you every spin. So in other words, the ratios in a lot of machines is it has a 13 cent takeout. So every dollar you put in, you get 87 cents back, but you lose 13 cents. In some machines, in the bigger casinos, they have a ratio payout a little bit higher than that. So you can be really lucky and you can go up to a machine and it gives you a payout. Now, if you took that money and walked away, it's the next person that's going to keep playing. Now, in a game of Monopoly, there is still luck. And in the game of investing, there is still luck, right? You know, how you roll that dice and move past that board or whatever properties you get to land on to buy, there is some elements of luck. But the longer you play, if you stick to the fundamentals, just like poker, blackjack, and all of those types of things, you can potentially increase the probability of success. So don't make no mistake for our community. When we decided that property was the investment vehicle that we took, that was an educated guess, and there was still risk involved. And in the work that we do in our business and taking people on that journey, we are still making judgment calls on locations every day. What's going to happen in this location? Is it going to gentrify? What's the investment dollars that is going to go into this location? What's the economy like in that location? Is there going to be a new development that's going to risk it? Is there going to be a rezoning that's going to risk supply for that type of thing? And anyone who says that they get it right 100% of the times, it's just simply lying. There's always going to be people who make mistakes. Even the best investors, you mentioned Warren Buffett before, his investment into I'm just trying to think, I think it was Goldman Sachs, it almost broke him. He had to go to Congress and basically say, this is the biggest mistake I've ever made. And if it wasn't for the support that he got, then, that empire could have also, been challenged. So the message that I say here is about patience and is about, educated information. So you turn information into knowledge and then you act on that knowledge through mindset. That's the sort of pyramid or process you take. So I think it's a good starting point to sort of say, don't just buy everything you get to, but our minds tell us we do. And we've talked about this before, Bryce, where there was a block of dirt in Perth across the road in Rockingham that we talked about that we could put 4 townhouses on. And I could have bought that block of dirt the first time I saw it for $175,000. And in the peak of the mining boom before the GFC, and it was $1.3 million for that quarter-acre block, 800 meters from the beach. Now it's still sitting there, unsold, and you could probably pick it up for 500,000. But so you're still going to experience these opportunity knocks and then try and make those judgment calls. And I think that's what's the fun part about unpacking the Monopoly story today, because as we move through these 6 points, you're going to pick up on some of the clues as part of that story.
Yeah. So folks, the idea is cash flow is just as important as accumulating the assets, and it may make sense to acquire a set in Monopoly more so than trying to acquire everything. So number one, always be patient. Number two, Ben, the most expensive asset doesn't necessarily always mean it's the best. So clearly, my son Samuel is an interesting case when it comes to Monopoly, but he's single-minded, focused on getting Mayfair and Park Lane. And if I land on it, once I like to maybe mess with their mindset a little bit, I land on it and toy with the idea of buying it. And you should see he's just like, it's almost walk away from the game material if I even think about wanting to buy that. But it could be fool's gold. We talked about this a little bit last week when we were, in our episode from $250 to $2 million properties. What does chasing the $2 million properties look like? Sometimes Mayfair and Park Lane actually makes sense. Their actual yield is really good, but their cost is also high. And quite often, if you get them on the first spin around the board, you're taking up an enormous amount of your cash that we all start with the same, which is not reflective of real life, but we all start with the same in the board game. And then you're taking up that. So it is a riskier play and not always necessary to not always necessarily the best move. Yeah.
Yeah, the calculated element of it, right? I mean, that's what you're working on here. You're working on a quick kill strategy of your opposition. And if they land on it and you've got a hotel or so on there, you just it is heartbreaking for the contestant who is
particularly who is just near go.
Yeah. So you can imagine their the want, and you can imagine the initial logic is that it's the most expensive, so it's the best, and I can wipe out the other players with it. When the reality is, as the game progresses, you are accumulating income, you're accumulating wealth, and potentially buying that as the second owner can ultimately be the success story that knocks the other players out really quickly. So it is a good lesson around that, and I think in real life, because this is the the takeaways we want, is don't buy the most expensive assets because they'll kill you for cash flow. And so that's what we did talk about on last week's show.
Mayfair is by far the most expensive real estate in London. We were talking off air. You were saying that only really if you're a sheikh you can afford it. Yes. And you think about in Perth, it's Peppermint Grove. In Brizzy, it's probably Ascot or what else in Brizzy? I'm trying to think on the south side. I've gone blank. In Sydney, it's clearly Vaucluse or Bellevue Hill. Down here, it's Toorak. Adelaide's Unley. So clearly they are enticing properties and they look amazing, but they're not necessarily the best ones in Monopoly, and they're not necessarily the best ones in real life, because buying them has opportunity costs and can leave your cash flow vulnerable and increase your risk. And really, investment is about making the most money, not owning the biggest and most expensive property.
We can, that's right. We can generalize. We are generalizing here, right? I mean, there was an article on Domain not long ago about $10,000 a week to live in a mansion in Melbourne, right? Well, if that had occupancy of 100%, so in other words, that it's exceptional cash flow and really, really strong capital growth. So there'll always be, exceptions to the rule, but we like to, we can't dive down specifically into every property in Australia and analyze it. So we just like to, we want to be careful. We're naturally conservative in terms of the advice we give to the community. And that advice is just simply, hey, it may not necessarily be the best. I said, if it's going to be your own home and you can afford it and cash flow it, but also build investments around it, it can also be life-changing again. If you ever downsize from it. So, but it's just an important message that strategically, as you're playing the game, sometimes you do let opportunities pass, and it can actually be for the right reasons, and you're in a better position overall.
That's a good point. You land on it and you might think, oh, I'll let this one go, which is hard. So number one, always be patient. Number two, the most expensive asset is not always the best. Number three, Ben, is to focus on cash flow. So within the context of monopoly, you don't want to sit on too much cash, but equally you want to avoid spending all your money right away. So there's some strategy. You do need to keep some cash on hand to keep buying the properties, particularly if you want to acquire a set. And you also need to remember that you might have to give cash to an opponent to pay a fee after picking up, a chance or a community chest card, right? So you need cash flow to survive the highs and the lows of each role that you have around the game. So it's important in Monopoly that you focus on cash flow, but Ben, also when you're building a property portfolio in real life.
Yeah, look, I mean, the times that you need cash flow in real life, if you have been too aggressive and you've leveraged yourself too highly, is also the same time that the banks aren't willing to give you any more, number one. And two, assets are distressed at that time. So asset prices are distressed at the time. So that's why it can be the ultimate whammy for those people who take on too much greed. And we see it every now and then with property developers who get a little bit ahead of themselves, and the next project that they're looking at is the one that will make them a multi-millionaire 20 times over, 30 times over. And so they risk everything on that particular strategy. And then all of a sudden a pandemic hits or a financial crisis hits. And they just cannot rescue themselves out. There's just not that and the people who are willing to give you the money, they're going to give it to you at double the cost. Oh, you want a quick million from me, or you want a quick 5 million from me? Yeah, 21% interest, thanks. And by the way, I'll take all the caveats across all your other assets, so I'm second in line after the bank. So yeah, look, it's just really important in life to understand that cash flow is king, and making sure you have adequate buffers, and you just don't get too greedy, people. Greedy is, in this particular case, can set the house of cards to collapse around you. So sensible investing over the medium to longer term with that patient mindset is going to be really good. Now, on the flip side of that, because we want to find that unique balance in the middle, is don't have too much lazy money. Having like if you've got 2 years or 3 years of defenses, and you've got a qualified qualification in an industry that's in high demand, and even during certain times you are required to do that work and perform that work, so your income will keep coming in, you're being over conservative. So it is about finding that balance, and that's why we always like to forecast cash flows over the longer term. And there are other levers you can pull in real life, where you can pull levers around reducing spending and so forth. In the game of Monopoly, you've got to liquidate. And when you liquidate, you get less for the asset. And that gives you a good lesson in life.
Well, I was about to say Monopoly dishes you up a very good lesson, Ben, because you do get less, and then you don't get access to the income if you've got anyone lands on it. So it illustrates that the borrower is at the mercy of the lender in that particular circumstance. So you make some really good points there. And I like the point that you talked about when we have an economic shock. So the people that were vulnerable through the GFC, the people that were vulnerable through the pandemic, were the people that didn't have enough buffer, because they were. The only person that gets injured when you get off on a roller coaster. The only person who gets injured on a roller coaster is those who try to get off before the end of the ride, and it's kind of. Now that dust has settled through pandemic, people will see asset values were jumping all over the shop, but now that water's found its own level again. But the people that got into trouble were not the people who were worried about the value of the assets. It was the people that were not in a position to actually still hold on to those assets through their cash flow. And I think that's really important. But it doesn't have to be a big shock like that. It can be a job change. It can be planning for significant changes. But that cash flow is so incredibly important. So it's a defense strategy for us around having a buffer, but also making sure that the portfolio is appropriate to you in terms of your cash flow and where you're at. So Monopoly gives us ample opportunities to see, effectively on paper, how this applies so that you can stay in the game. But there's so many analogies and parallels that we can do in real life that you'd be mad to miss the lessons. But the players tend to really focus only on the price of the properties, but the game gives that opportunity to learn about yields and rates of return as well. Because, for example, the red properties collectively offer you about a 16% yield, but the blue properties offer you a 25% yield, right? And then you go, oh, okay, the 25% is good. But if we circle back to point number 2, the most expensive is not always the best. So it's about finding the balance between what's appropriate for you, what yield you can chase, but also what you can maintain for your portfolio so that you don't go bankrupt in real life.
Mate, well said, well said. So let's run through them. Number 1 was always be patient. Number 2, the most expensive asset is not the best. Number 3 is focus on cash flow. That's where you'll get hurt and you'll have to liquidate. And that's not great in the game of life, as is in the game of Monopoly. Number 4 is diversify your investments.
Diversify your investments.
I think we've been pretty consistent on this. We most commentators and people, even Warren Buffett tells you to diversify, right? Yet in his own portfolio, he doesn't diversify because he's a subject matter expert in what he's doing. And so that would be the case. Now, we've talked about diversification too. We are very much heavily skewed towards residential property. And we've taken that view in terms of, we've been lucky on that view over the last 25, 30 years because a lot of Australia's wealth is caught up in residential property. It is well supported. And because we also know how it generates economic activity through the wealth effect and through spending and so forth, is that the game is almost in our favor, right? Because it's an essential need, number 1. Number 2, as I said, it's too big to fail. We've talked about this 3 or 4 years ago, where we said it's just too big to fail. The governments could not allow the risk of an economic collapse in land prices and property prices. The modeling looks horrendous. And we wouldn't just be talking about a recession, we'd be talking about a depression. So, and we've seen it recently in the pandemic. The government went households and they also went property to stimulate that economic activity and those jobs, right? So for every $1 that goes into property, $10 is generated in additional economic activity, both direct and indirect. So it's a very safe way for the government to go, and that's why the economy's in relatively great shape compared to those around the world. We've got the health crisis intact, and now we've got a wonderful economic story there. So when we talk about diversifying, we really are talking about borderless investing and getting your portfolio appropriately balanced based on your cash flows of that day. So if you've got really, really strong cash flows, we want to get one of those capital growth assets where we can cover the base. But if we're short on cash flow, we can still get into the game, get a balanced asset or a little cash cow as part of that waiting game until we maybe get the 2 incomes coming back into the household again. So there's definitely some ways in which we can diversify, Bryce.
Yeah, definitely, Ben. So buying. So if we go back to the Monopoly, if we buy up properties in Monopoly, you earn your money if someone lands on your square. So that's number 1. But with 40 spaces on the board, chances are slim that a player will end up on yours if you only have 1. So the idea of buying in certain pockets around the board really gives us that analogy around borderless. So maybe one side of the board is the West Coast and the other side of the board is the East Coast and the other side of the board is the South Coast. And so if you think about it that way, buying multiple spots around the board gives you a better chance of the probability of people landing on them, but it also allows you to use data to take calculated risks. Because if you think about borderless investing, for some people, that's just mind blowing. But then if you do use some data and realize that you can get a lot of research done without actually leaving your screen or your tablet or your mobile, there's plenty of things that you can do to gather data, to gather confidence, to talk to people. That really investing cross borders is not too dissimilar to investing across town, because there is some geography challenges from where you live to where the property is. But also, there is a way to understand the differences between buying in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, WA, those sorts of things. So the diversification story is often about having sort of an averaging effect of one's going up, one's going down. Therefore, on average, it's going okay. Well, our view on diversification is unlike some people in our world, Ben, who are just hell bent on one particular asset class. You and I both have shares, for the record, and we've both done well through shares. But our focus is well and truly on building our residential property portfolio for the volatility reasons we've talked about many, many times on this podcast. So the diversity for us comes around not buying 3 houses in one street. It's around having 3 houses in multiple locations with the added layer of considering that being interstate from where you live. So we 100% agree with the diversity that Monopoly teaches in a board game, crossing over into real life.
Yeah, and we've talked about the benefits of reducing your costs in real life because of land tax. In some cases, stamp duty is cheaper in some particular markets, but we also come back to the fundamentals. Now, we want to invest for the long term. We're a buy hold advisor and advisory. So from our point of view, but that doesn't discount us the opportunity to time the market, to look at the demand supply ratios in particular areas and say to ourselves, if we get in here now over the next 3 to 5 years, we expect an uplift. So there is an opportunity cost in terms of allocating our funds in a particular area. So we're also looking to get into that market. I mean, if we had have bought in Perth in 2014, we're now starting to see Perth market moving higher, but there would be that opportunity cost. Whereas if we had to put that money into Sydney, then we would have been able to get a substantial uplift, which would have put us in a better equity position. Now, we still think, 30, 40, 50 years from now, as part of that long-term passive income play. But it is important to note that the borderless element also brings us into different markets in different times. And that's how we can potentially get a better result in those earlier stages of the investing before potentially the property then settles down to its long-term trend, which is also where we enjoy the rent as well as the capital growth on top of that.
There you go, folks. Monopoly teaches you to be borderless as well and to diversify your investments. So 1, always be patient. 2, the most expensive asset is not the best. 3 is focus on cash flow. 4 is diversify your investments. Number 5, Ben, this will be a surprise to everyone. Location matters. I had a little dig around on all the blogs around Monopoly over the last 24 hours, Ben, and statistically, I'm not probability expert. I remember vaguely my stats unit that I did back in first year of uni in my commerce degree. But the best set, according to a few blogs that I saw, to own was Orange, which is Bow Street, Marlborough Street, and Vine Street. And the single most landed on probability is in the red set, Ben, and it is in fact Trafalgar Square, which is the one just before the station from memory. Let's have a quick look at that. Yeah, Trafalgar Square is just before Fenchurch Station. So interestingly, they're not the most expensive, but they're strategically very good locations for you to have probability, so you can collect the rent. So there's heaps of parallels here around finding locations that'll get a tenant, location, and not necessarily having the most expensive. So there's a fair bit in this one.
Yeah, and if you know the game, and if you read the chance card and the opportunity knocks card, you know that community chess card, not opportunity knocks. Community chess card.
I was just wondering which game you played, mate. It was a Collingwood version.
Well, that is that opportunity knocks, right? There was an old TV show I think called that. If you read all of the cards before you play the game, you'll actually know that there's quite a few cards that take you to certain spaces on the board, right? Trafalgar Fair is one of them. The other one is, I think there's one that takes you to Mayfair. Mm-hmm. That's the game killer if you don't own that one. Yeah. There's Pall Mall, I think was the other one. So,
but it also takes you to go too, Ben. But past go, so you cut laps past all of those expensive ones in that last lane. Yeah.
So again, this is about probability. If you land on those ones, they're the ones you've really got to say to yourself, well, I've got to seriously consider buying this and adding that to my portfolio. Now, in real life, when we talk about location, we are ultimately talking about the scarcity of the land. It's the land that appreciates. That's where the ultimate capital growth will come from. If you also have highly desirable and emotional buyers, you are going to get an uplift, as well as people can afford to buy it is a big part of that gentrification and looking at the profile of the area. And what we do know is that over the long term, between 6 to 6.6% has been the long-term average of compounding returns in Australia. Now, that has been on the back of reducing cost of money over time. Double household incomes, we've talked about this a lot. So don't expect that you're going to see 8s, 9s, 10% compounding returns in certain markets forever. But there are still markets inside where if you draw a line through the middle of the average, then there are going to be some above average and there are also going to be some below average. But the bulk are going to be in that bell curve of around the average. So that's relatively confident if you're thinking over the long term. But if you can time that market well, where you can see some uplift, because property prices don't move in a linear line, they move, in spurts. And so if you can get that spurt and then it settles back down to its long term, you've done really well, because it allows you equity to move again if your cash flows allow. So there's a lot of important elements of why location matters in real life, but it's also very true if you want to be the monopoly king in your household and race your car or your boot around the course as quick as you possibly can.
Yeah. Well, the red and the orange are around the free parking, which is not bad. But it's is there any sort of play that the fact that some of the most expensive on the board is around jail? So fine line between expensive property and going to jail.
Now you've got me curious.
Well, green and blue are some of the most expensive, and that's on the lane just after jail. So you either
that's the go to jail. Yeah, the jail. Yeah, now I'm with you. Yeah, I've got
dancing with the devil there, right? So you either make sure that your business practices are legitimate. Otherwise, there's a little lesson in there for all of us. So they go 5 location matters. We've said this before. It's called location Australia, Ben, my show. It's not called property Australia. So it's important that real life matches the game of Monopoly. And in this case, it does. So that was number 5. Number 6, passive income is the key. You pass go and collect $200, Ben. That's a given unless you get sent to jail. But in order to stay afloat in Monopoly, you need to be generating some passive income by charging rent on your properties. And similarly, by making an investment, by purchasing a property, could create a steady stream of revenue for down the line. So they're the principles of Monopoly. But clearly in our philosophy of lifestyle design, it's around doing the things that you want to do with your time rather than doing things you have to do with your time. And that comes from being strategic with what you buy, retiring out some debt, and having some passive income from the properties in real life. Surprise, surprise, Monopoly mirrors real life here, Ben.
It does. And in the real life story for us, the element of being able to gear and leverage gives us a competitive advantage in a low volatile asset, which is residential property. And we've done that to death on this podcast, but we'll continue to keep reminding our community that it is that cash on cash return. So using sensible leverage for productive return will deliver that passive income. And then not getting too greedy and then getting too higher an LVR and then getting yourself into the pitfalls if something goes wrong in your own cash flow environment. Pay down that debt, and all of a sudden that passive income just continues to build. You've got time, that patient return that you get, and then all of a sudden, the properties are delivering you a really handsome, rent that's going to be part of the passive income for retirement, which will complement your super, and you'll be in, really, really good shape, not just to have an average retirement, but basically to have a very comfortable retirement. And coming back to the lifestyle design story here, that's exactly our message in terms of we want you to be able to have experiences and not have to worry about money in the future. And, you can still have a good little nest egg and think you're okay, but then you have a serious health scare and all of a sudden just having a baseline level of security there in retirement won't be enough potentially for you. So we want to make sure that if you are going to have this delayed gratification story, passive income has to be a part of that. And then ultimately the asset appreciation will complement that passive income over time. So it is a win-win-win story. Win in terms of passive income, win in terms of capital value and an asset base you can pass on for the legacy, and win in terms of lifestyle design, so you can build up those experiences for yourself and your family. So yeah, it can't be any better than that for those people who are willing to take the calculated risk of getting started to build out what they want to achieve.
Passive income is the jam. That's what you want. That's the fruit of why you do all of this in the first place. If we segue from Monopoly to Robert Kiyosaki's game of cash flow, Ben, for you to get from the rat race, which is in the middle, to the fast track on the outside, it's very simple. You have to build up your passive income to be greater than your monthly passive income has to be greater than your monthly living expenses. And as soon as that happens, you reach financial freedom, which puts you out onto the fast track on the outside, and you get all these opportunities that are only available if you are on the fast track, which then further creates leverage, which shows that there is actually a lot of economic inequality for the people who are wealthier. They can get wealthier because of the opportunities that you get from being wealthier too. So passive income is incredibly important, folks, and it's what we focus on. I think that's something that we've differentiated from the beginning of this podcast, Ben. Hopefully we've now become a new part of the vernacular for anyone in the investment industry. But early days when we were starting in our first 100 episodes, we were trying to get people to focus on buying just enough properties and then retiring out the debt so that you then just had enough passive income to do that, rather than buying more, or using equity to service your lifestyle, which means that you are forever requiring capital growth, and then that capital growth train, and you're using, and so your debt was actually getting greater through that. We were pioneering at the time that we want the debt to be retired out and you'd have the passive income, and for you to not be buying, 10 plus properties. So that's important. Passive income is really, really important. It's about being no Porsches, no jets. It's just the basic lifestyle design that you're after. So there you go, folks. There's the 6 property lessons from Monopoly. Number 1 was always be patient. Number 2, the most expensive asset is not always the best. Number 3, focus on cash flow. Number 4, diversify your investments. Number 5, location matters. And number 6, passive income is the key. Thank you, Monopoly, for reminding us of those very, very important lessons. Now, I've got a final note here, Ben. What Monopoly also teaches us is to be aware of and wary of potential cheating. so that happens in families when they're playing the game, and it also
I rolled a 9, not an 8. I don't have to go back to jail.
It's not my third double. It's only my second double. I don't want to go to jail. So little tongue-in-cheek one there. So which is really, really cool. So hopefully that's
kudos to the creators of this game, mate. It stands the test of time. It is ingrained in every generation, pretty much pre-war, post-war, baby boomers. We've all played the game because it is an absolute reflection on life. And my final observation of it is, in looking at the streets and the suburbs that are named on the board, because it's a combination of the two, right? So, but it also tells you about the knowledge of what the creators had about the fact that when you get a popular street, what actually happens to that street? It turns from freestanding houses into mixed-use houses, and then eventually gets rezoned into hotels. And that's what we absolutely see in these areas, and that's what makes the land so valuable. And that's why we've always talked about, the potential upside of inner city land is the repurposing of that land. So if you own a freestanding house closer into the city on a good patch of dirt, in any capital city, you'll have the benefit of time, and you'll see the value of that capital growth that comes into that land as well. So I just think it's incredible in terms of how they put all that together back in the early 1900s or was it late 1800s or whatever. It was amazing.
Over 100 years ago. Insight. Turning apples into apple pies, Ben. Put some hotels on eventually, gets to amplify the passive income that you can get from that property. So very, very good. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is with the upcoming school holidays. If you've got kids, why don't you play Monopoly with your kids this school holidays? If you don't have kids, why don't you get a group of adults together and play this game? But here's 7 reasons why it's a good idea for you to play Monopoly with your kids this school holidays. Number 1, it teaches the financial basics. Number 2, it forces kids to do maths. Number 3, it teaches property ownership, which we've just been talking about. Number 4, it teaches how loans work. Number 5, it develops negotiation skills. Number 6, it explains the basics of taxation. Do not land on that one just before you go through go, Ben. Otherwise, you'll be giving up tax. You don't want that. And number 7, it illustrates what I said before, economic equality. Life isn't, you don't start with the same amount of money, but with Monopoly, you do start with the same amount of money. So it's an even playing field with a bit of luck thrown in through dice throwing and probability. But ultimately, you will see that the richer you get in Monopoly, the more power and the more it just becomes this constriction in the end where you will get someone to go bankrupt. Very, very good. But it has stood the test of time. You mentioned that, Ben. There are only a few games designed over 100 years ago that still remain playable today. So Monopoly is one, and a few others: chess, Scrabble, and checkers. So it has stood the test of time.
Hey, as you know, mate, I'm traveling at the moment, so I'm in a short-term accommodation here, and there's 3 board games that are in the main part of the living room. What do you reckon one of them is?
Monopoly. I feel like you're setting me up for Monopoly as an answer, which is good. But
yes.
But being a Collingwood supporter, I didn't know if you're trying to kneecap me as well. So Monopoly.
Yeah, so it just goes to show you it's everywhere. I mean, how many of those weekend stay houses that you go into and there's a board game Monopoly that's just sitting in there, an old version of it. So I don't know how many millions of games that they would have sold, but they're everywhere, and so they should, because it is a
and then the versions, and then the versions where they change the streets, and then we've got the version which is the cheaters version, which tries to encourage you to cheat, and it's like, oh, not sure about the morals of that one. But there we go. Very good. Monopoly. What's making property news today, Ben?
There's a good survey that's going on through the ABC at the moment, basically, which focuses in on, what do they call it? The sort of Australia's assessment that they're doing at getting people to put in their Australia Talks national survey. It is 2021. And obviously, I did the survey recently, and a lot of people have done that survey, but there is something in there that just highlights the importance of retiring comfortably and why it is a problem. So I'll just read through some of the stats, because obviously it's concerning for a lot of households. It's also concerning for women who have to do obviously some caring duties throughout the course of their lives in the past, and so that means that their super or their nest egg is a little shallow. So let's just go through it. So of the people who have done the survey, women who believe that they don't have enough, so being able to retire comfortably is the question. For them personally, 34% very much a problem, 30% somewhat of a problem, 23% not much of a problem, and 14% are saying not a problem at all. And generally across Australia, 52% of people are basically are saying that there is a problem with retirement. So very much a problem.
Yep.
44% are saying somewhat of a problem. And the other numbers are just so much smaller. They're not relevant. For men who are classics when it comes to, I'm generalizing here. I'm generalizing here, but they've got this a fantasized talent. So for a classic case in point, very much a problem, 25% versus the 34% for women. Somewhat of a problem, 30%, matching the women at 30%. Not much of a problem, 29% compared to women, 23%, and not at all, 16% compared to 14%. So it's just interesting. They also have a sort of, I suppose, a rose-colored glasses view of retiring comfortably as well, when they're sort of saying, what about generally for most Australians in terms of what they observe? They only think that 41% very much a problem, and 47% somewhat of a problem, and then 12% not a problem at all. So they do think that because in their own environment, if they're earning and they're full-time working and not doing any caring, that they think, generally Australia's in pretty good shape. But the big takeaway for me there is just, and we've reinforced this in a lot of stories that we talk about, and that is that a lot of people aren't necessarily going to retire comfortably. And, there is a good, sort of understanding of that. And I'll finish this, what's making property news, just by basically saying that a lot of people assume, what is these measurements? So what's a good yardstick that you can use, a good benchmark that you can use? And Treasury, our government Treasury, say that if you can maintain between 65 and 75% of your pre-retirement income after tax, they're saying that you'll be okay. But we're not a podcast about okay. Our community is not a podcast about okay. Our community is about aspiring Australians developing their lifestyle design and being on the right side of that ledger in terms of being able to get to where they want to get to. So if you leave it to chance and you leave it to other elements, you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of that ledger. So do what you can. And in some people's cases, we want to acknowledge those people who are very much starting from, way behind the 8 ball. And that's challenging for them, but we still believe the reason why we do what we do is that we do feel that every Australian has the opportunity to improve their financial position. And that's what we're here to share. And those people who do it consistently, and I'll circle it back into our podcast message today, patience over time will get you there if you continue to build those habits and execute on those habits as well. So that's what's making property or maybe investment news this week, Bryce.
Oh, very good. So there's a good message in there for people to, it doesn't have to be too intense. You can learn some of the basics. We're hoping that our podcast plays a part in that, but it's really about trying as best you can to set yourself up so that you don't get yourself into a position where the categories were very much a problem and somewhat a problem, and they were dominated those two, right? So you don't want to be in those two categories. So there you go, mate. It's always fun to hang out with you, riff it. Enjoyed it the best of times talking to you about property stuff, but when we throw a bit of fun in there with a 100+ year game in Monopoly, it always gives it an extra layer. But mate, until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks.
Hey there folks, Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listened to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarizes the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.